Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another in the series of Curating Culture. I am Georgette McGlashan Miller, Research Fellow at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank, and your host. Today we have with us Dr. Michael Barnett, CSE, Commander of the Star of the Order of Ethiopia, and he'll be sharing with us on Rastafari as an African-based spiritual movement. Dr. Barnett is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Kingston, Jamaica. His area of specialization are critical race theory, African diaspora studies, and Rastafari studies. In April of 2017, he was vested with the Ethiopian Knighthood, Commander of the Order of the Star of Honor of Ethiopia by the Ethiopian Crown Council for service to Ethiopia and the Crown Council. By virtue of this investiture, he is one of a handful of Jamaicans to be inducted into the International Society for the Imperial Ethiopian Orders. Of note is that he has authored numerous journal articles on Marcus Garvey and Rastafari. He single-authored the book, The Rastafari Movement, A North American and Caribbean Perspective, and is the editor of the very popular Rastafari anthology, Rastafari in the New Millennium. Additionally, he has co-edited two books on Rastafari, such as the Rastafari anthology, Leonard Percival Howell, and the Genesis of Rastafari, and the Rastafari anthology entitled A 2020 Vision Perspective on the Rastafari Movement. He has also had several journal articles on Marcus Garvey and Rastafari published locally and internationally. Please help me to welcome Dr. Michael Barnett, CSE.
Okay, thank you, Georgette, and thank you to the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica for the invitation. And as you just heard, the title of this presentation is Rastafari as an African-based spiritual movement. Now, the Rastafari movement originated, of course, in the island of Jamaica in the early 1930s and has always been, I would argue, an African-based and African-orientated movement. African-based as many of its practices of clear African origins. The drumming practices of the early Rastafari, for instance, the Howellites, was that of Kumina, and this is a drumming style of Congolese extraction, and is in fact still very much part of the Howellites' worship traditions, even today. Among the more contemporary groupings of Rastafari, such as those of the Nyahbinghi Order, the drumming style they practice is known as Nyahbinghi drumming, but this is essentially an amalgamation of both Kumina and Burro drumming styles, and both of which are of African origin. Then there is the preferred dress style of many Rastafari, both men and women, which tends to be that of African garments, whether dashikis or African patterned dresses and skirts. These are very popular dress apparel for Rastafari. Another exhibition of Africanity by Rastafari, I would argue, is the wearing of their hair in dreadlocks or locks. The mere act of letting one's natural African textured hair grow into locks by not running a comb through it for an extended period of time is one clear way of celebrating the texture of African hair. Which other texture of hair, I would argue, can be matted into locks as easily as African textured hair? Even the smoking of ganja can be linked to the influence of the Congolese who came to Jamaica as indentured workers in the 19th century, in addition, of course, to the influence of East Indian indentured workers. The African orientation of Rastafari is clearly depicted by their veneration of Emperor Haile Selassie I, who was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia on November 2nd, 1930. The early Rastafari leaders, in fact, made a point to preach to black Jamaicans that they should cast off the key colonial compulsion of worshipping the English king, King George V. This is in the 1930s, and instead worship the African king, Haile Selassie I, who I should add was formerly known as Rastafari before he was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I. So the name of the movement comes from Emperor Haile Selassie himself. Now, while Ethiopia holds a special place in the hearts of Rastafari, the whole entire continent of Africa is in fact is dear to the Rastafari flock. They consider it the motherland. And so when Rastafari vocalize repatriation, it is not just about going to Ethiopia to settle, but other African countries as well, such as Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa, which are also popular options. Of interest is that the largest Rastafari community in the world dwells in South Africa. Census information indicates that the Rastafari community there is at least 3 million strong. So here we have an interesting phenomena in that Rastafari in Jamaica birthed itself from African influences, such as revivalism, and from Pan-African voices, such as that of Marcus Garvey, and from the grand coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie himself. But at the same time, they have also influenced Africans on the continent. So we have a circular relationship of sorts. Now, very importantly, even the growing of locks by the Rastafari, which didn't really start until the late 1940s, is deemed to have been influenced by the Mau Mau warriors in Kenya, who at that time were actively and visibly rebelling against British colonial forces in that time, according to late Rastafari scholar Barry Chavons. So there's an argument that the growing of locks by Rastafari in Jamaica was a direct African influence. And then in turn, as I said, the Rastafari movement goes on to become more established. It in turn influences very strongly Africans on the continent. Let me segue a little bit into some of the musical contributions from Rastafari. And I'm going to look at two reggae luminaries, and this not only being Black History Month, but celebrated as Reggae Month seems to be appropriate. So let's consider Peter Tosh with his pivotal album, Equal Rights, and this is really my favorite Peter Tosh album, I should just say. And this was released in 1977. And interestingly enough, on this album, we have seminal tracks. The notable track on the album, for one, is Apartheid. And this highlighted to the Black South African community that the Rastafari community in Jamaica were well aware of their plight. And not only was there awareness of the horrors of apartheid, but here was Peter Tosh openly and vocally advocating for the system of apartheid to be resisted and broken down. With his other tracks on the album, for instance, Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights and Equal Rights, here was Peter Tosh openly advocating resistance against oppression, all of which must have been very encouraging for the Black South African population at that time, I would argue. Now, in fact, in 1983, after just releasing his album Mama Africa, Peter Tosh flew into Swaziland, which is in southern Africa, on the border of South Africa, to perform at the Somlalo Stadium in Mbane, Swaziland. And this was on the December 17th and 18th, 1983. Notably, Peter made a point not to enter South Africa itself out of principle, as it was still under apartheid in 1983 at that time. So instead, he actually took the route from going from London to Germany and then from Germany to Zimbabwe. And then from Zimbabwe, he took a chartered plane to fly him straight to Swaziland. So he made a point not to physically touch the ground in the state of South Africa at that time. With his track African, which is also on the Equal Rights album, Peter's message is resoundingly clear. So long as you are black, you are African. It doesn't matter where you live or where you reside. Once you are black, you are an African. And this Pan-African sentiment, strongly communicated by Peter in this song, is one that is strongly held by the Rastafari movement as a whole. in the title track, Mama Africa, Peter speaks on the matter of repatriation and venerates Africa. Here are some of the lyrics from the title track, Mama Africa, on the album Mama Africa, released in 1983. Mama Africa, how are you doing, Mama? Mama Africa, long time in a see you, Mama. It's the chorus. Verse 1. They took me away from you, Mama, long before I was born. They took me away from you, Mama, long before I came on in. And in verse 2, there's so many things about you, wondering where you are. They try their best to hide you, Mama, but I search and I find you. And then it goes on, it's another verse I share. In you there is so much beauty. In you there is so much life. In you there are so many kingdoms. To me it's out of sight. So we see the veneration of Africa here clearly by Peter Tosh in that song. Now looking at our other reggae luminary, Bob Marley. Now, I want to make a point that Bob Marley mustn't just be reduced to the song One Love or Three Little Birds. Bob Marley had some very political, revolutionary material. If we look at his pivotal album, Survival, this particular album is pregnant, I would argue, with Pan-African sentiment. In stark contrast, perhaps, to the album he released previously, which was Kaya, which, you know, is more laid back than Survival. So the tracks on this pivotal album, Survival, are 1, So Much Trouble in the World, 2, Zimbabwe, 3, Top Ranking, 4, Babylon System, 5, Survival, 6, Africa Unite, 7, One Drop, 8, Ride Natty Ride, 9, Ambush in the Night, and 10, Wake Up and Live. Now, the tracks I want to zero in on this particular album are Africa Unite, Survival, and Zimbabwe. Let us look at the lyrics for Zimbabwe. And before I go into the lyrics, just to say, this song was written by Bob Marley in support of the Black Freedom Movement in what was once Rhodesia and formally became Zimbabwe on April 18th, 1980. And the lyrics for Zimbabwe go like this. Every man got a right to decide his own destiny, and in this judgment there is no partiality. So, arm in arms, with arms, we'll fight this little struggle, because that's the only way we can overcome our little trouble. And then the chorus goes, brother, you're right, you're right. You're right, you're so right. We're going to fight, we'll have to fight. We're going to fight, fight for our rights. Natty dread in a Zimbabwe, set it up in a Zimbabwe, mash it up in a Zimbabwe. Africans are liberate Zimbabwe. So this track, this song had great impact on the black freedom fighters fighting guerrilla warfare in the bush in an effort to liberate their cause, to liberate their country. And it provided a great deal of encouragement and motivational energy for their struggle, I would argue. So much so that it was no surprise that Bob Marley was invited and extended an invitation to perform at the Grand Zimbabwe Independence celebrations of April 1980. And Bob Marley did indeed perform. And he was so dedicated, he actually financed some of the costs, the expenses of flying in equipment and flying in his band to Zimbabwe. Performed at the Rufaro Stadium in Harare on April 17th and helped to usher in Zimbabwe's grand independence celebration from the British and local white rule. So that's a landmark, historical landmark in the history books. So the other track I want to look on the Survival album is Africa Unite. Very profound, very seminal lyrics in my opinion. Africa Unite because we're moving out of Babylon and we're going to our father's land. Yeah, and verse 1 reads, how good and how pleasant it would be before God and man to see the unification of all Africans And it's been said already, let it be done. We are the children of the Rastaman. We are the children of the Ayaman. All right? And then a pivotal verse, I think, looking at verse 3. So Africa, unite. Africa, unite. Unite for the benefit of your people. Unite for it's later than you think. Unite for the benefit of your children. Unite for it's later than you think. Africa awaits its creators. Africa awaiting its creator. Africa, you are my forefather cornerstone. Unite for the Africans abroad. Unite for the Africans a yard. You know? And so the Pan-African sentiment is very clear, very strong there. Cannot deny that. And look at the lyrics for the title track of the album, Survival. For Survival, it goes, how can you be sitting there telling me that you care? When every time I look around, the people suffering the suffering, in every way, in everywhere. Say, nah, 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 nah. We're the survivors. We're the black survivors. And for me, this speaks to a point that Rastafari make consistently, that we of the African diaspora are the black survivors. Our ancestors endured the most brutal, the most inhumane regime and institution, and that is centuries of chattel slavery, as an outcome of the horrific transatlantic slave trade. And this is not something that should be taken for granted. So all of us in the African diaspora are in fact black survivors. Because if our ancestors never managed to survive that, we wouldn't be here. So that certainly, when I first heard it in 1979, made a seminal impact. Now I'm biased because for me the golden age of reggae music was the 70s. A lot of the protest music, a lot of the emotional mindset was towards, agitating for equal rights, agitating for, removing down pressure, as Rastafari said. And I just wonder if that political zeal still remains in the music generated by our artists of today. That's another conversation. So that's, looking at musically how Rastafari have expressed the Pan-African sentiment and their connection to Africa. I'm going to say very quickly a little bit about the revivalist roots of Rastafari. And I should just say that Leonard Howe, very importantly, is, somebody that we can consider, is widely considered as the founder of the movement. But in fact, there were other movers and shakers in the Rastafari movement, and there were precursors to Leonard Howe, importantly, Marcus Garvey. I don't know if we could perhaps share some of the slides. Forward that to the next slide. Keep going. Go to the next one. Yes. Let's stay with Alexander Bedwood. So Alexander Bedwood was a renowned preacher and renowned native Baptist mover and shaker. And he was instrumental in essentially communicating to black people in Jamaica a sense of self-worth and a sense of empowerment and so forth. But importantly, he basically provided a bedrock, as do other revivalist movements, for Rastafari. Very importantly, he had a lieutenant called Robert Hines. And Robert Hines was not only a lieutenant for Alexander Bedwood, who essentially his main period of presence of influence in the black Jamaican community was 1895 to 1921, when unfortunately he's locked up in Bellevue from 1921 all the way up to 1930. But Robert Hines, his lieutenant, goes on to become a lieutenant, a very influential and strong lieutenant for Leonard Howell. So Robert Hines represents a bridge between the revivalist movement and Leonard Howell. And it is interesting if we go to, could we go to the slide, the very first slide actually? No, the next one, yeah, this one, right. So this is a slide of the grand coronation of Haile Selassie and his Empress Menen. And they were crowned majestically in 1930, 2nd of November. And this was a world-renowned coronation. It was something that was very globally known, not just to the Rastafari movement, globally. 72 nations went to Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, the capital, to give their respect for this coronation. And it is interesting that not only do the early Rastafari leaders recognize this as a very significant moment in history, and people like Leonard Howell and Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert declare Haile Selassie as God in the flesh, as the personification of God in the flesh. That also we have revivalists declaring Haile Selassie as the supreme being, as opposed to a lesser spirit, Unzambe Umpungo. And Professor Clinton Hutton writes very profusely on this, on how revivalists actually had great admiration, not just admiration for Haile Selassie, but some notably in Jamaica actually saw him as the supreme being, as opposed to a lesser spirit. And in fact, he interviewed a revivalist called Brother Man, who argued that from 1940 he came to see Haile Selassie as the supreme being. So, in addition to this, and I'm saying all of this to show that there is some linkage between the revivalist movement in Jamaica and Rastafari, and they're not at all disconnected. And very importantly, we should, as Professor Barry Chavans makes note of, that the revivalist movement carries a great deal of African tradition. So this notion of conversing with the spirits, of conversing with the ancestral spirits, of a crossroads between the living and the departed. The symbols of the cutlass and the flag and so forth, cutting and clearing to remove evil forces and so forth. All of this points to African retentions, African traditions. And some of these have in fact been imbued into the Rastafari movement. So I'm just saying that outside of Rastafari movement's veneration of African traditions, African practices, revivalists also played an important part and in fact acted as a bridge. And St. Thomas, very importantly, proved to be a very good recruiting ground for Rastafari adherents, as this was not only a parish where many revivalists were based, but also importantly Kumina practitioners, many of whom, as I had said previously, were descendants of 19th century Central African, that is Congolese, immigrants to Jamaica who actually came over as indentured workers. And St. Thomas also had a distinction of not being so Europeanized as some other parts of Jamaica, arguably. So Rastafari in its early years had a great deal of growth in the parish of St. Thomas. And so in 1932, Leonard Howell, I don't know if we can go to that picture of Leonard Howell. Leonard Howell, there we go, yeah. So Leonard Howell, along with his lieutenant Robert Hines, do much of their recruiting for their Rastafari organization in St. Thomas. And it was relatively easy for them to do that because of the strong African orientation of the community there in St. Thomas, we could argue. There's also another important first-generation Rastafari leader. That's this slide, Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert. And Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert has a distinction of going to Costa Rica in 1924 and basically engaging himself in an Ethiopian Masonic order that existed in Costa Rica at the time. So he, in fact, was a master Mason in his own right, but a Mason from an African leaning, an African perspective, as opposed to the European Masonic orders. So he himself was imbued with Ethiopianism, and so when he comes back to Jamaica in 1931, he actually starts preaching that Haile Selassie is God in the flesh and the importance of Ethiopia to black people generally. So he's another one of the first generation leaders. Also, we must not leave out the impact Marcus Garvey made to some of these forerunners. And if we go to, there we go, Marcus Garvey. He laid the groundwork for much of the Rastafari movement in the early years. And in fact, the famous quote from him in the late 1920s, apparently, he said, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king." And also, Garvey was an Ethiopianist in his own right, and he did much to strengthen the movement of Ethiopianism. Leonard Howell, importantly, was in the U.S. from the 1920s, during the 1920s. He doesn't come to Jamaica till 1932, but while he was in the U.S., he was a member of Garvey's UNIA, and he was very much influenced by Marcus Garvey's organizational techniques, I would say, and Garvey's general, not just his organizing abilities, but his precepts, his philosophies, and his perspectives. So that for Leonard Howell, there's a direct influence from Marcus Garvey in that he was a very important adherent in the Garvey's UNIA in the 1920s. So I haven't said much about Archibald Dunkley. Could you go a bit further into the slides? So yeah, Archibald Dunkley, this picture is taken in the late 70s. He was another early preacher of Rastafari in the 1930s. And unfortunately, I'm still searching for a picture of Robert Hines. I haven't come up with the picture yet, but hopefully during the course of this year. But Robert Hines was another very important leader in the first generation Rastafari movement in his own right, because he goes on to organize his own organization after 1935, when he's released from jail, because I should just say that him and Leonard Howell were jailed for sedition in 1934, March 1934, and this is in the Gleaner, is detailed in a March edition of the Gleaner. I think it's March 17th. But they were unfortunately jailed for sedition for saying that black Jamaicans should consider Haile Selassie as their king as opposed to King George V. I mean, that was to show you how serious those times were. I mean, this was colonial Jamaica, so you couldn't speak your mind that freely at that time. So, in a nutshell, what I'm arguing here is that, in fact, Rastafari is very very, very entwined with Africa, with the continent of Africa. And in terms of repatriation, I didn't say anything that much about repatriation, but that also is a very strong sentiment of Rastafari. That because we have been wrongly, our ancestors were wrongly ripped away, torn away from the continent of Africa, that one way of repairing the psychic and mental trauma of this is for us to seek to return to Africa ourselves as the African descendants, to repair that mental and psychic trauma. So this is something as well that Rastafari are very concerned about and have been very consistent about. And so this has become one of the elements of a reparations document. There's a 10-point plan reparations document that CARICOM have put together. And we have a CARICOM's Reparation Commission, a CRC, which is actually headed up by the Vice Chancellor of UWI, which is Professor Hilary Beckles. But that came into being in 2013. And notably, they took note of Rastafari's consistent cry or clarion call for repatriation as part of a reparations package. All right? So all of these things we can consider as Rastafari having an intimate connection and connectivity with the continent of Africa. All right? I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Barnett. That was a mouthful and a lot of information. Just reiterating stuff that has been said before about Rasta's consistency in, reminding us that we are from Africa and their hope to go back to Africa through repatriation. Do we have any questions from our online audience? All right. One of the important things that you brought out, Dr. Barnett, that stuck out to me was Robert Hines. I know of the connection between revivalism and Rastafari in terms of the physical output, what you can see with the gowns and the turbans and even the silverjack and the rod and those obvious things that you mentioned, the machete and the drums and the flags and the banners.
Yeah.
Those are the obvious things, but that connection between Robert Hines working with Bedward and then with Howell, that is something that would have been some philosophical transfer, in terms of teachings and African qualities that they would want to pass on. That is important. And Robert Hines isn't somebody that is highly celebrated or mentioned.
Yes.
As you said, you're still searching for a photo. When you find that, we want you to come back again.
Yeah.
So one question here says, why is it that revivalists or the revivalist movement resonated so strongly with the early Rastafarians?
Well, as I said before, not only did you have the influence of Robert Hines, but the inherent African practices that are embedded in that movement were very attractive to the early Rastafari leaders, because there was this move, look at it as a decolonization project then. So move from sort of going back to your roots, going back to African practices, embracing African traditions, rather than being ashamed of them, right? Mm-hmm. It's going back to our roots and our traditions. Why should we necessarily discard them and so forth? So I'm saying that for those, and remember that the initial recruiting ground for the early Rastafari was in St. Thomas. Yeah. And here you had a group influenced with this strong Congolese community, who were very vibrantly rich in their Kumina practices and so forth. So there's something with African orientation and with a Pan-Africanist orientation, such as Rastafari, would have been very attractive. But generally speaking, there was this quest, if you like. There was a void that needed to be filled, because remember, you're in a climate that denigrates African traditions, African spirituality, and so forth. So there was a pushback against that by some people who say, why should we be ashamed of our African traditions and African spirituality? Why not embrace this, the past, and then thus empower ourselves in this way?
Okay.
And we consider all of this as part of a decolonization project of sorts. Yeah.
Barbara Blake Hannah says, an excellent presentation, which it was a lot longer. Another question, well, more of a comment. You mentioned it also in your presentation about the music. Talawa Adodo is asking, in contemporary context, how do Rastafari negotiate Garvey's prophecy with Haile Selassie's divinity in light of the historical disagreement between them?
Well, there's many ways we can look at that. I mean, in Rastafari, I consider Garvey as sort of John the Baptist, a forerunner. But it doesn't necessarily, because there was some discord between Marcus Garvey and His Majesty, His Imperial Majesty, over the strategy of leaving Ethiopia as opposed to staying and fighting with the second Italian act of aggression. So we know in 1935, under Mussolini, the Italians seek to overrun Ethiopia. But I think that if Marcus Garvey was alive, and other persons in the Rastafari movement also will agree, I'm sure, that if he was still alive in 1941, when we had Victory Day, right? Notably on May the 5th, 1941, Haile Selassie, Ethiopian troops and some British troops is able to take back Ethiopia. This is 1941. So then Ethiopia is free once again and is liberated. And if Garvey dies, unfortunately, July the 10th, 1940, so he doesn't get to see that. So, Ethiopia being overrun by the Italians. Remember, this was the only uncolonized nation on the continent. So I can see how frustrated and how, dejected he would have felt. But to see that Ethiopia is able to declare victory, ultimately. And, over the space of 5 years of occupation, which, so Ethiopia hasn't never been colonized in the real sense of the word. They were occupied for 5 years, and horrendous acts, I should say, of genocide were committed against much of the Ethiopian population during that time, but they were resolute, and they were resilient, and they survived. And I really believe, as do others, that if Garvey had lived to see that, he would have changed his tune. He would have changed his tune. He wouldn't have been so critical of Haile Selassie, of His Majesty.
Okay. We have another question from Shakara. He's saying that you touched a little on the St. Thomas connection, and in particularly Kumina's influence on the ritual and the language. Could you talk a little more about that, the language in terms of Congo and Bongo and its use in Rastafari?
Yes, well, some of that language has carried over, so that's a very important fact. So certain members will be, you could say Bongo, Howie or Bongo James and so forth, which has come from that Congolese, that Kumina tradition. So that has been absorbed by the Rastafari movement. So that's a very good point there,
Okay.
the name in the reference to different adherents in the movement.
Okay, that came directly from the Congolese
Yeah.
and from Kumina practice.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So you spoke about music, and for many persons internationally, reggae is their introduction to Rastafari. You mentioned, in a little question to say, if the music now is like the music then with the militancy and the advocacy. You want to talk some more about that?
Well, I'm biased because, to be honest with you, that's when, I started listening to the music in the 70s. And in the 70s, it was, and maybe because it was a time of protest, of discord, and when there was still very obvious oppression taking place. But the artists, and I just happened to mention was Peter and Bob, but many of the artists were speaking to the injustice that was taking place across the world, I mean, actually, the song "Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights" is co-written by Peter Tosh and Bob Marley.
Yes.
Let me just say that. But to come up with a song like that speaks to the mindset that exists. Get up, stand up for your rights. Mm-hmm. And then remember, Peter in 1977 has the album is entitled "Equal Rights." So he has a song "Equal Rights and Justice," which is a mantra that people have used in protest marches and so forth, and you could put a tagline on there: "No justice, no peace," and so forth. But this was the time, this was the sentiment of the time. I was very aware of that because I lived through that. And maybe, as not to say that everything is hunky-dory today, it's clearly not. The world is still in a state of turmoil. But I think there are more distractions maybe and other stuff going on. But not to say message music is still out there. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? We have message music out there. And I must also make note of some of the young artists there, like a Kabaka Pyramid, Chronics.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the Rastafari Revival.
Yeah, Protege. Mm-hmm. I mean, for lack of a better term, but some of us have a problem with that reggae revival because reggae revival, as though reggae has died, because reggae has not died. But we know who we're talking about. So we give thanks that they've sort of, some of these artists, the younger artists, have carried the torch, and that's good. But it's not as let's say as strong as it's not as concentrated, the amount of message music, as it was in the 70s. You're just inundated with the message music, whether it's coming from Burning Spear, whether it's coming from the Congos, or you know what I mean? You had all these bands. This was, to me, when reggae music reached a peak in terms of, because the influence of Rastafari was undeniable. And let me just say a quick thing about that, is that it's Rastafari that really brought the message into reggae music.
Yeah.
All right? And they were very instrumental in its development in the 60s as well, the message content, We see Bob Andy with the song "I Gotta Go Back Home," and countless other songs. But the music was just vibrant, was very rich with messages and with
message of black identity and
African identity and repatriation.
Well, the internet is burning up with spirituality questions. I see about 3 more questions here, and let me see what order I'm going to put them in. There is one about from Peter Espute, that you mentioned revival and Kumina influences on early Rastafarians. But what about Burro? But before you answer that, let me also let you hear this one from Shakara, that is asking if you can speak about how the extent to which Rastafari being birthed out of these African spiritual retentions. Some Rastafari expressions became hostile towards them. For example, in the burning out of voodoo and obia. So those two I would want you to address.
All right, let me tackle Peter's
Right,
question
about
first.
the
Burro.
Burro first.
Burro is very important. I made mention of it, but probably didn't emphasize that the Nyahbinghi drumming that we have now is an amalgamation of Kumina and Burro. It's a
You did say
fusion.
that.
So all of these different African drumming practices, and we're very creative persons. So there is no one drumming pattern, I should just say as well. If people observe the different mansions of Rastafari, okay, you'll find it's different drumming patterns. So the Baba Shanti, their drumming style is different than that of the Nyahbinghi Order. And even today, I should point out, there are Howellites still alive, remnants of Leonard Hull's movement. They still drum Kumina, okay? They still drum Kumina. So we see there's a diversity of drumming patterns. Homeland of Africa, they didn't just come from anywhere. And if you are venerating Africa, if you are seeing Africa in all its glory, then all of that is part of these African traditions. Yeah, so there's a kind of contradiction there in itself that needs to be addressed. You know what I mean? That's the reality. That's something that we probably have to discuss further.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's also the issue of Rasta's negotiation with accepting biracial Rastas, non-black Rastas, to the fellowship, I guess, if you could call it that, the interracial relationships then that exist. How would you talk about that?
Well, so you have various, let's say, waves and developments in the movement, and you have different focuses, different areas of thought regarding this. So there is this argument, though, I should just point out, that maybe each mansion has a different perspective on this. So it's varied, right? So for instance, Baba Shanti would be probably most resistant to adherents in the group which are non-African, right? Or when I say non-African, I mean not black, because if you there is another point that if we go back way in the distant past, the human race descended from the continent of Africa. But I'm talking about recent descent, right? Relatively recent African descent. The truth is the EABIC are resistant to taking on members from all different nations and so forth, right? The Nyahbinghi Order, everyone to their own vine and fig tree, which means you can be a member of the Nyahbinghi, you're Japanese and Asian and so forth, but you are encouraged to stay within your particular national group or racial group, right? And then 12 tribes basically now have opened the door to interracial participation in the mansion. So the truth is that Rastafari is not a monolithic movement, right? So it's nuanced in that depending on which Rastafari grouping you talk to, you'll get a different perspective. Yeah? Okay?
Okay. So I think my final question would be, to what extent do you think Rastafari has been accepted by the Jamaican Society?
Well, there's relatively more acceptance now than during the 20th century, and Coral Gardens was a flashpoint in Rastafari history, 63, where Rastafari were persecuted and beaten and humiliated nationally,
And you're talking
not
about
just
Coral
by
Gardens.
Coral Gardens atrocity. We call it. It is recognized every year in the month of April. Over the Easter weekend, because it was an indication of how Rastafari was seen as the dregs of the earth in Jamaica at that time. Now, things have definitely improved, but the discrimination against Rastafari is not totally disappeared.
Okay.
There is still discrimination, and Rastafari looked down upon in some cases, and it's a kind of another binary contradiction, because here we have recently an example of how Bob Marley has put Jamaica on the map, especially with the recent release of his film, or at least the premiere. Look on the outpouring of people to the premiere of that film,
Yeah.
One Love and so forth. And Bob Marley, in a way, has been utilized in maximizing our tourist industry, truth be told. So on one hand, you have Rastafari that are helping to promote brand Jamaica, but to what extent are the Rastafari community benefiting from that, and to what extent are they respected, all said and done, in general, as part of the Jamaican constituency? You have certain exemplars who are pushed and promoted, but for the general rank and file membership of Rastafari, what is the situation they find themselves in? These are questions we have to look at.
Yeah, and then the outward appearance of accepting Rastafari in terms of locks. You'll hear that we have ministers who wear locks, but these ministers aren't Rastas, and neither are they promoting or advocating for Rastafari. Then I don't know if you listen to recent, well, it's not Rasta, it's dancehall music, Valiant. I think it was sometime last year, came out with his song Rasta that caused a little furor around Mana Rasta. No mix up, no pasta. What do you think about that?
Well, I basically, that to me, the song, showed that Valiant doesn't have a deep understanding of what Rastafari is about. Mm-hmm. So it's actually, for me, it's a misrepresentation, in a way, of what Rastafari is all about. That's my perspective. That Valiant didn't have an in-depth, introspective perspective about what is the real substantive message of Rastafari. It's not just a fashion thing, and it's more fashion, and it's more what you eat. There's more to Rastafari than that. Yeah?
Do you think that perspective is shared among, say, that generation?
It's a good question, and I think those people who have inserted themselves as part of the Rastafari movement, like Chronics and Kabaka Period, would be aware of what Rasta is about better if you are actually part of the movement. Okay. So there is a insider-outsider dynamic, but there's that to be considered. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Dr. Barnett, thank you very much. It's been an interesting session. I know we have a lot of questions online. We probably will have to respond to some of these comments afterwards. But thank you for coming. It was great, and we will certainly look to have you again, especially when you find some information on Robert Hines. All right. Thanks to our online audience for staying with us, and we're going to ask you to look out for all our events in the month of February under our program AYA, where we will be showcasing the ACIJ and what the ACIJ JMB does. For every Thursday in February, we will be having an event. On the 15th, we'll be having a film screening on Revivalism. On the 22nd, we'll be having another film screening on Kumina. On the 29th, we'll be having a youth forum talking about spirituality, where we will have a member from the Rastafari community, Revivalism, from the Maroon community, and also from the Muslim community. So you will hear more about those events. And also on the 25th, we'll be having a sacred attire showcase where we'll be showcasing revival dress, turban, and be having a discussion around that. So until March the 7th, which is our next first Thursday of the month, stay with us for Curating Culture, where we curate to educate.